One of the things you'll find through your study of history is that a great number of conflicts over the course of time have been a direct result of economics. Now, the economic policy that was predominant at this time was called mercantilism, and this was going to cause a great deal of friction between the colonies and England. Those grievances, those problems that the colonists had with the crown, combined with the economic issues, were going to lead to a very, very volatile mixture that would eventually take us down the road to revolution. Now, out of the 13 original colonies, and we're talking here just about the colonies that would eventually become the United States. Now, there was the attempt during the Revolution to make Canada essentially the 14th colony, but we're only going to be looking at those original 13. Now, out of the 13 colonies, only one, Georgia, was actually formally planted by the British government. Okay, every other colony throughout the land had been started by private companies, they had been started by religious groups, they had been started by land speculators, things along those lines. Now, a number of these colonies, the ones in particular started by companies and land speculators, things along those lines, those were done for the purpose of trying to raise some money. The British government at this point in time embraced a theory called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism was predominant throughout the world at this point. It was starting to change over to a form of capitalism that we would recognize today, but generally speaking, this was still the big thing. Now, we look at the economics of today as understanding that you can be an entrepreneur, that you can go through and you can create wealth. You can invent something or do something that's going to generate wealth just almost out of thin air, it would seem. Mercantilism didn't see things that way. Mercantilism looked at your economic wealth, your country's wealth was measured exclusively by how much gold or silver you had in your treasury. And it was also believed that there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world. As a result, the only way your nation was going to become more wealthy was if some other nation became less wealthy. This is why you would see so many of the original colonists coming to the New World thinking that they were going to find all the gold and silver that had been found and brought back to Europe by Spain, for example. Now, to get all this gold and silver, it was necessary for a nation to export more than it imported. Okay, this is called a favorable balance of trade. The idea is you have to sell more stuff than you actually buy. Your nation sells whatever finished good it might happen to be. You're able to hold on to the money from that, and you spend less than you made by buying stuff. If you can produce more of the things on your own and you don't have to import them from another country, that means that your nation is going to grow in wealth. Now, countries that had colonies had a distinct advantage. And this advantage came because of the fact that the colonies would be able to provide, first and foremost, raw materials. Okay, they would be able to provide, for example, let's say the wood necessary that was in abundance in the New World. They would be able to provide the wood that would be necessary for shipbuilding, for furniture, for whatever purpose. Colonies could also provide wealth. They could provide just generalized supplies. All of these things were able to be sent from the colonies back to the mother country. So, as we're looking at the colonies here, you're talking about all the different colonies being able to provide raw materials to England. But that wasn't the only thing. The colonies also provided a ready market for selling manufactured goods. So all these raw materials would go back to England. Okay, they would go into the factories, they would come out as a finished product, and then that same finished product would be sold back to the same colonists that had provided the raw materials to create them. The idea was that England would actually produce the finished goods, not the colonies. In fact, there were laws that were set up to make sure that the raw materials here couldn't be transformed into those finished goods. It was a way that Britain would be able to increase her wealth while at the same time keeping the colonies, on a very tight leash. Now, with all this in mind, was that for America, it meant giving Britain all of the ship's stores, the sailors, and trade that they needed and they wanted. Britain was in charge. We were the colonies. We were supposed to do what we were told. We were supposed to provide the raw materials or the supplies or whatnot, and then England would use them as she saw fit. So we had all that. We also, at the time, we were here to grow tobacco and sugar for England. Okay. These would be items that without us, the Brits would have to buy from another country. If they had to buy these from another country, then that would mess up their balance of trade. If they were getting them just directly from their own colonies, they didn't have to spend the money on them. So while we weren't really the most important aspect of the British Empire, we did provide some goods that were definitely needed by the British. Now, because of all of this, really handcuffed American trade. We weren't able to just buy and sell, do as we pleased, create a product and then sell it for whatever we could to whomever we could. There were very distinct rules set up as to what we were allowed to do and what we weren't allowed to do. Now, the navigation laws were the most infamous of these laws to enforce mercantilism. These were going to be very much hated and ignored for a while until after the French and Indian War, really. Okay, now the first of these was enacted in 1650, and it was aimed at rival Dutch shippers who were trying to elbow their way into, essentially American shipping. So you think about it, you've got all these various goods, raw materials, and things like that. There were those people from other nations willing to ship the goods and service the goods for a fee, of course. England did not like that. However, they wanted American or the colonial raw materials to be shipped only on British ships. So the idea here is to try and prevent the colonists from using anyone other than the British to ship the goods back and forth. Okay. Now, the navigation laws restricted commerce from the colonies to England and back through only those English ships. Nothing else was ever going to be allowed. In fact, if you were using anyone else, you could be found guilty of smuggling and you could face some serious consequences as a result. Now, other laws stated that European goods that were being sent to America had to first land in England where custom duties could be collected. So let's say you were a colonial, you wanted to buy something from, we'll say, France. Okay. So you purchase whatever it is from France. It couldn't be shipped directly from France to you in the colonies. It had to first go to England. It would go to England. There they could collect custom duties, in other words, taxes on whatever that good was. And then from England, it could be shipped to you in the colonies. This was a way for the British government to get, a little extra money off of your purchase. You can think of it sort of in a way today as like, an extra sales tax that would be added on. And again, this did not sit well with the colonists. Now, there were also certain products listed as enumerated goods, which could be shipped only to England. There were different monopolies that England had on items coming out of their colonies that they really wanted to keep a very, very firm hand on. And as a result, again, the colonists were handcuffed. They couldn't sell the way they wanted to sell, and England retained their control that way. Now, now the settlers were also restricted in what they could manufacture at home. For example, you could make woolen cloth, you could make beaver hats and whatnot if you were making those exclusively for yourself. If you were making those for you or your family to use, that was all right. That was no problem. The problem arose if you ever decided that you were trying to make those to export. If you were trying to make those for sale overseas, then there was going to be an issue between you and the crown. The idea was that the colonies were not meant to be a manufacturing hub. They were meant to export the raw materials for England to be the manufacturing hub. The idea was that we were going to feed the British economic engine. Okay. Now, the Americans at this time, we had no currency. Okay, we think about currency today. We think about the bills that we have in our wallets or purses, things along those lines. That wasn't the case for the colonials, okay? We didn't have currency, but we were constantly having to buy things from Britain. So as a result of that, the gold and the silver that we did have in the colonies, that was constantly draining out of America, going back to England. Now, without having this currency or without the gold or silver, a number of people were reduced to just straight up trade and barter. The idea was that the colonists we're going to have to figure out some way around the problem. Now, they were at one point even printing paper money. Now, we don't think much about paper money today. It's referred to as fiat currency. We don't think about that much today. This was pretty rare at the time, and it wasn't really a good solution. The paper money depreciated, it became worth less and less. And so, as a result, there were more and more grievances. The colonists looked at this and blamed England. Now, colonial laws, whatever they were, could be voided by the Privy Council. Now, the Privy Council is a group of advisors at this time to King George. Essentially, what could happen was the Privy Council could look at any law, anything passed in the colonies by a colonial legislature or anything like that, and they could just say, no, that's not going to happen. We're Xing that out. We're voiding that. Now, there were approximately 8,500 colonial laws passed around this time. Grand total 469 of those laws were actually voided by the Privy Council. Now, granted, this was a very small percentage of the total laws. But again, the colonists looked at this as an abuse by a tyrannical government. They had no representation in the British government in their mind. The king argued that he represented all of his subjects. But the colonists didn't see it that way. They were growing more and more to view England as a foreign oppressive government that was controlling their lives without their consent. And this grievance would continue to grow, it would continue to fester, and eventually it would explode into a revolution.